there, I'm Anne Diamond, and today I'm here to introduce you to a very grand old lady of the seas, the Cutty Sark. She is not just a ship, she's a legend, and she's had an extraordinary life. Built way back in 1869, this incredible clipper was designed for speed as a cargo ship, in fact bringing tea from China to Britain and beyond, and boy did she deliver. At her peak, she could race across the oceans at a staggering 17 knots. That's fast for the day. She was, in fact, the Ferrari of the seas. By rights, she should have been dead and scuttled a century ago. But thanks to one man's vision, just an ordinary sea captain called Fred, who recognised her from his own seafaring days, loved her and wanted to bring her home, the Cutty Sark has been given a whole new lease of life. It's an amazing story. So let's go inside and meet someone who can tell us all about her, curator Louise McFarlane. Hello, nice to see you.
Welcome.
Gosh, look.
Here we are.
I know, isn't she amazing?
This is it. This is Cutty Sark in all her glory.
And you get such a fantastic perspective. It's with all of the lines going in different ways.
You do. I think this is a perfect place to see the shape that helped to make Cutty Sark quite so fast.
Well, let's go down and see her.
Let's do that.
Well, Louise, it's wonderful to meet you. You're the curator here of the Cutty Sark. How does that feel when you say it like that?
Oh, it feels great. It's lovely. If I meet new people and I say that, I always get, that's an amazing reaction, which is a nice feeling.
Because this ship is legendary, isn't she?
It is, yeah, absolutely. It's world famous, you know, it's an icon.
Feels a bit daunting sitting underneath her, actually.
It does, yeah. I mean, we've got 963 tonnes above us.
Oh, thank you for
yes.
that. Yeah.
But it's safely secured.
Yes, well, I'm glad you say that. She is renowned as a tea clipper, one of the fastest ever clippers there ever was, if not the world's fastest. But what is a clipper?
Well, clippers were ships that were pioneered in the United States in the 1840s, and they were ships which put a premium upon speed rather than cargo space. So they were relatively small vessels, but they were really concentrated on speed. Now, they had three main design characteristics, and this is a great place to see these, which helped to make these ships fast. And the first is this long, sort of streamlined hull, so that's the kind of skeleton, the body of the ship. The second is this really, really sharp bow. That's really, really thin,
sharp,
really
isn't
sharp.
it?
Yeah, that's there to cut through waves rather than ride atop. And then the third is a three raking mast. So Cutty Sark's main mast is 150 feet high. Now that would support an absolutely huge canvas area. So all of those things in combination were there to make these clipper ships as fast as possible.
So she sliced through the waves.
Sliced through the waves. And the name is thought to come from the term to go at a clip. So again, it's all about speed and pace.
Right, but she was a cargo ship, wasn't she?
She was a cargo ship, absolutely. So these clippers, they put a premium on speed rather than cargo space, but that meant it made sense for them to carry high-value cargoes such as tea in Cutty Sark's place.
Yeah, tea, of all things, was so highly prized at the time. It had now, I mean, in Britain, it had become fashionable by the time she was built.
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, tea was introduced to Britain in the 17th century, and at first it was very much an aristocratic drink. It was a very exclusive drink, but by the time Cutty Sark was built, it was a drink for everybody. So it's estimated that working families were drinking tea twice daily. So it was huge, huge business.
Yeah, a bit like olive oil is becoming now, isn't it?
A bit like that, absolutely.
That's right. So tea was highly prized. But, I mean, before that, people, particularly in the shipping industry, used to meet in coffee houses and things like that. I gather there's a story about King Charles and his wife, Catherine, who sort of made tea fashionable.
That's right. So Catherine Braganza married Charles II, and she brought with her some tea from Portugal. And actually, when she arrived in the UK, she arrived in Portsmouth, and it had been quite a ropey journey, so she was suffering from seasickness, and she asked for a cup of tea. And unfortunately, they were kind of bewildered by this and gave her a beer instead.
Oh.
Yeah, so it wasn't maybe the best introduction to Britain for her. But yes, she absolutely, because she had that tea, she made tea fashionable in the court, and then that, of course, sort of filters down into society.
And suddenly you get tea as being very highly prized cargo, as you said.
That.
When she was built in, 1867?
1869.
1869. They were obviously already building steamships by then to do a lot of the heavy lifting. So why did they at the time decide to build another sail ship?
Yeah, it's interesting. It really is. But I think for a generation of shipbuilders, like the owner of Cutty Sark, John Willis, they knew where they stood with sailing ships. So they knew how reliable, they knew how to get the best out of sailing ships. Steamships were still a sort of unknown commodity. And also you had to pay for their fuel. Cutty Sark's fuel is absolutely free. It's the wind, absolutely. So steamships for some were kind of an unproven entity. And there was this misguided belief, as it turned out, that steamships or iron ships would cause tea to sweat and therefore ruin. So for a generation of ship owners like John Willis, sticking with sailing ships made the most sense.
So when she started out her life, was she mostly going to China and bringing tea back to Britain from China?
That's exactly it, yes. Yeah. So for her first 8 years of working career, she went out to China and back. But actually, it was the introduction of the Suez Canal. So I've sort of mentioned before in other interviews that Cutty Sark's story is one of kind of luck and survival against the odds.
Yeah, she escaped certain death at so many times in her career. And it is amazing. She is an incredible survivor, apart from anything else.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so let's go through some of these awful near scrapes. Because the Suez Canal, explain that one, how that forced her from the tea trade.
It did, yes. So in terms of bad luck, so in the same week that Cutty Sark was launched, the Suez Canal opened. Now, the Suez Canal provided a shortcut back from China of over 3,000 miles because ships no longer had to go all the way around the continent of Africa to enter the Indian Ocean. But the Suez Canal was only viable for steamships. Sailing ships like Cutty Sark couldn't make use of the canal. There were tricky navigation conditions in the Mediterranean. There were also expensive tolls to deal with on the canal itself. So steamships were able to use this shortcut effectively. So when Cutty Sark first set out in 1870, in the trade for which she had been built, there were 60 other sailing ships doing as she was, sailing out to China and back. Just 7 years later, there were only 9. So that's the sort of very quick impact that the Suez Canal had on the tea trade and on clipper ships in general.
So they had to rethink business for her?
Yeah, completely. So they were sort of floundering for a few years. For a few years, Cutty Sark did what's known as tramping. So it would take different cargoes, whatever cargo it could find, basically from different ports, port to port. But that didn't make too much money. It wasn't too successful. So eventually, Cutty Sark was entered into the Australian wool trade. Now, this was a trade that many other clippers had already entered, and this was a trade where Cutty Sark really came into its own. It was also because Australia being much further away, didn't yet have the infrastructure needed for steamships, so it was a viable option for sailing ships like Cutty Sark.
Yeah, because the wind still operated down there in the south.
Exactly that.
So Australian wool to be brought back to Britain again.
Yes, that's it. And because a lot of clipper ships had entered that trade, this spirit of competition that had been there for the tea trade sort of continued in the wool trade. So they were still racing against each other.
Ah, and she was fast.
She was very fast, yes.
How fast?
Well, top speeds recorded 17.5 knots, which is about 20 miles an hour, which
doesn't sound very fast.
It doesn't sound very fast. So, you know, when you're in a car, that's nothing. But I was on a boat a couple of years ago, and we got up to 7 knots, and I can assure you that feels very, very fast.
Really?
So 17.5 knots would have felt practically terrifying, I would have thought.
Yeah. So actually, to go back to her crew, before we talk about some of the other disasters she managed to avert, there were only about 26 crew doing this phenomenal speed and this incredibly long journey.
That's exactly it. So it's very, very few people. When you think also that there's 11 miles of rigging on Cutty Sark and potentially
11 miles of rigging.
11 miles of rigging. So all of the rope that was controlled, all of the sails, 11 miles of that, potentially 32,000 square feet of canvas to control as well. So a huge amount of jobs to keep everyone safe, effectively, with very few men.
So 26 men, probably all men, yeah. Who were they? What sort of people? And I mean, obviously you had a captain, a cabin boy or something, I don't know. What sort of jobs did they do?
Yeah, so it was quite a hierarchical arrangement, like in any merchant service. So you'd have your officers, you'd have a master or a captain, you'd have a first mate, a second mate, and a steward who would look after all of the officers. And they would have, at the back of the ship, they had their own quarters. Then you'd have the petty officers like a carpenter, maybe a boatswain who'd be in charge of sort of the condition of the ship. And you'd also have a number of apprentices. So these were boys who'd signed up for a career at sea in the merchant service, but they were actually signing up for free. So they'd basically sign a 4-year contract where they wouldn't be paid, but what they were getting in exchange was
learning
the trade. And
how old would they be?
as young as 14, so it could be 14. Most of them were about 16, so very, very young. And when you think the vast majority of Cutty Sark's voyages, they'd be away for at least 9 months. That's a long time for a 14-year-old to be.
I was just imagining their mothers kissing them goodbye. Yeah. And frankly, not knowing whether they'd ever see them again.
Absolutely.
Because these journeys were perilous.
They absolutely were, completely. And we have a few records of young apprentices being as young as 16 and deserting in China and Australia. And you think they've gone to start this whole new life on the other side of the planet at just 16.
Oh, hello there. You must be the new apprentice that Captain Woodgett was telling me about. Well, welcome aboard the Cutty Sark, built in 1869 and still going strong. My name is James Robson, and I was born in 1853. Now, I know what you're thinking. Don't look half bad for my age, do I? And I'm the ship's cook and the longest serving crew member on board here. I've sailed on it for over 10 years, a record only matched by Captain Woodgett himself. Now, listening to the way I talk and looking at my appearance, where was you thinking I was from? London? Hackney? Japan? China? Well, true story this is, right? Now, not a lot of people know this, but when I was a baby, I was found floating on a wooden raft in the middle of the South China Sea. But luckily, there was a ship passing by, and the captain on it, he saw me from it, and he picked me up from the water. And his name was Captain Robson, and he took me in and raised me as his own adopted son. And that's how I came to be, James Robson, raised in London, Poplar to be precise, and that's why I talk the way I do. And I've been sailing on ships ever since I was about knee-high.
This is pretty obvious, isn't it?
Yeah.
But this is the real thing?
This is the real thing. This is the ship's wheel. And it's interesting because I think we all think it must be facing that way, but actually, of course, we'd be facing that way.
Yes.
This is the back of the ship.
Yeah.
In order to be steering effectively, you want to be standing on one side and pulling the spokes around.
Yeah. So the captain or whoever
Yeah.
would be on more or less where you are.
Absolutely.
It wouldn't
or
be
on
like
the other
this because
side.
you'd be steering backwards.
Yes, that's
Okay,
right.
I get it. And then you get the magnificent feeling here of the length of the whole ship.
That's right, absolutely.
And the rigging, how much rigging did you say there was?
So it's 11 miles of rigging. So
You start to see how that mileage would be used up. 'Cause
Yeah.
everything's about ropes.
Absolutely, and how much sort of teamwork you'd need and how much kind of choreography almost to make sure that you're all doing things to keep the ship moving.
I just can't get over how sort of like it's a bit like a Victorian house, isn't it?
It is a bit like a Victorian
With
house.
this beautiful
that's what it
woodwork.
was, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the designer of Cutty Sark was quite influenced by yachts, so that also, I think, contributes to the appearance of Cutty Sark.
When you look up, people actually went up there.
They do, and we still have people regularly going up.
Have you ever
actually.
been up that high?
I've not been up
No.
to the top,
No.
but I have been up.
Have you?
It's quite scary.
Okay. I don't think we'll volunteer.
And that's with safety equipment and a harness. They
yes,
of course
exactly.
did that without any of those things.
So now you sort of get the feeling of walking the length of the ship.
Yeah, you do, absolutely.
And the weird thing, I don't understand why, but I feel it rocking already, and it's not, of course, at all.
Well, I mean, on this deck and particularly on the deck below, there is a bit of a camber. So obviously, this is so that any water that came off the deck could easily spread off the side.
Yes.
So it does give you that sense actually of movement. It's quite
does.
strange.
Yes,
Yeah,
it is.
Yeah.
But when you look up,
Yeah.
I can imagine it in full sail.
In full sail, yep. 32,000 square feet of canvas. It will be flapping away.
Yeah,
Obviously, at the moment we can't
noisy,
have...
very noisy.
Very noisy, exactly, yeah. And at the moment we can't have that up because, of course, it would put too much strain on the mast when we're doing
What a
static.
shame, actually, because
I
it would be a
know.
lovely sight.
Visually, it would be fantastic, wouldn't it?
Here is the kitchen, the galley.
Yeah. Yeah.
And my goodness, it is small.
It is very small, yes, yep.
He said he was cooking 4 meals a day for 26 men.
Yep. So he's there all the time,
Yeah.
effectively. Yep. Obviously got a nice tiled floor because, as we know, Cutty Sark and fire is not the best mix.
No. So that was the only tiled floor in the entire ship.
Yeah. Yeah.
Woo.
That's
That's the carpenter's workshop. And it's that wide.
Also very small. I mean, realistically, the carpenter would have had to have brought things out.
Yes,
onto the main
and work
deck,
out here.
But you know, all of his tools were kept in
Wow.
there. And actually, we do have a chest that belonged to one of the carpenters of Cutty Sark, and that's that chest just in there.
Ah, brilliant. So this is the sleeping quarters.
This is one of them. So this is the deck house for the lesser qualified men who are on board, the ordinary and able seamen.
I see what you mean by the slightly shortened
Yes.
bed space.
Yeah. Very snug.
As you say, they weren't as tall as probably we are now.
Probably not.
But nevertheless, you'd have had to learn to sleep with your knees up.
You would, absolutely, and hunch yourself in if you wanted any chance to actually stay in your bunk.
But at least they're not hammocks.
No, that tended to be more of a naval thing, actually, than merchant ships.
Yeah.
But yes, so they had these, and these are their mattresses, which are called donkey's breakfasts because they're full of hay. And I'm not sure how comfortable they were.
No, they look a bit like, dog beds now, don't
Yes,
they?
yes.
And you still feel it's amazing. I'm feeling the ship rocking.
Yeah.
It's such a weird feeling.
Yeah, some people genuinely do get seasick on board.
Yes.
And here we are, the Master's Saloon.
Isn't this beautiful?
Which is rather more salubrious than some other settings on
Oh,
the
it
ship.
certainly is. It's very nice indeed. Everything's sort of heavy, obviously, because of the
Heavy and
tempestuous sea.
Yes, and well thought out. So, I mean, this is a seat which doubles up as a bench because you can move this forward so that plates don't slide off. And then even better, I think, are these gimbals. So these gimbals were, if you put your drinks in the holders, they can easily move with the movement of the ship and you don't spill any valuable, lovely rum.
I think that's wonderful. Do you know, I thought there were two lights, a bit like, snooker table lights dangling low, which they are not. They're drink holders.
They're drink holders.
And like candle holders probably as well.
Yes, yeah.
Something, I don't know.
This is where the officers would actually eat, but also this could be a space where the master might actually entertain. So he might invite people on board. That might be how he negotiated cargoes sometimes.
I see, yes.
So
Some
nice
serious business might be done
Serious
here.
business might be done. And also some navigation as well, that's why I have some charts.
And a proper coal-fired
coal fire,
fireplace.
Yes, which tended only to be used when they were in port. For obvious reasons. Yes, absolutely.
But it's lovely that he's got it.
It is, yes.
It's a nice piece of Victoriana.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So this is where the other officers had their own cabins, and this is the pantry where the steward would prepare all of the officers' food. So they'd actually eat the same food as the rest of the crew. They might have got slightly better cuts, and I'm sure it would have been more nicely presented, but essentially they were eating the same food as everyone else.
Yeah, so it wouldn't just be brought up or down from the kitchen. It would be prepared here a bit more
nicely
as
prepared
well.
here by their steward.
It's very nice, isn't it? What's the monkey doing there?
Well, there were actually monkeys on board Cutty Sark. So the longest serving master on the ship was a man called Richard Woodgett, and he picked up 2 monkeys while in Indonesia. So that monkey there is a little nod to the fact that there were once monkeys on board.
Well. Yeah, it doesn't belong in a kitchen though.
No, I don't think it does.
Yeah, another bedroom, second mate, and more here, the first mate.
First mate. And then the steward as well. So it was an important position, the steward.
Very.
Looking after
Not
all
bad
of the officers.
compared to others, exactly.
Yeah. And this is the anchor deck. So this is right at the front, or the bow of the ship.
The anchor deck.
The anchor deck, that's right.
The anchor's at the front.
That's right, yep.
Why
That's
don't
where
I
they'll be
always
stored.
think that the anchor would be at the back of a ship?
They're stored at the front. So there's one over there.
Oh, wow.
Absolutely. Yes.
Oh, my goodness. This is the business end, though,
This
isn't it?
is absolutely the business end, yeah. I mean, it's a perfect place, really, for Cutty Sark because most of the voyages, Cutty Sark loaded and unloaded the vast majority of its cargoes just northeast of where we are now, at East India Docks.
India Dock.
Yeah, they're no longer operational, but in terms of location, they're just northeast of where we are today.
And isn't it amazing how she's pointing now, from her grand old age, she's pointing now to the sort of the business end of the city.
I just think there's a really nice connection there, isn't there? Because that's what Cutty Sark was here for. It was about trade and business, and now it's facing sort of the modern version of that.
It's sort of bridging the 2 centuries, I suppose.
I think so.
Oh, that's wonderful. You've made a lovely video of the ship's cook. Obviously played by an actor because he couldn't be 200 plus years old, but he's playing the part of a real person.
That's right.
Whose name we know.
Yes.
And I don't know whether he was as much of a Jack the Lad as is portrayed in the video, but it gives you an idea of what sort of characters there might have been on board.
Yeah, and there were so many. We were very, very lucky because we have what we call crew lists. So we have crew lists for all of Cutty Sark's years as a British ship. And that basically gives you the name of the individual, their rank, how much they were paid, where they were from. So it starts to build this fantastic picture for us of the people who served on Cutty Sark. The vast majority of the crew actually served only for one voyage at a time. They'd sign up in London, do a full voyage back to London and be paid, and then they go and find another ship. So the cook that you mentioned, James Robson, he's quite unusual because he served on Cutty Sark for 10 years. He was the longest serving cook on board.
He must have been good.
I think he was, and it coincided with the Cutty Sark's most successful period, and I don't think that's a coincidence because, you know, food is so important for morale and, well, literally for your energy. So I think it's no coincidence that he was there when it was most successful. But yeah, I think he was a bit of a Jack the Lad. He seems to be a very interesting character. There's a claim that he was born, well, we know he was born in China, he was from China, but there's a story that he was found abandoned in the China Seas as a baby, scooped up onto a ship by a British captain who then brought him back to Britain and raised him in Britain. We don't know if it's true. We've been searching desperately through archives to find out if that actually is true. We're wondering maybe it might be a story he told apprentices just to make them go away. We don't know. But either way, I think it paints a picture about the individual.
Oh, it really does. In fact, you were telling me a minute ago that, I mean, these stories still come to life, the evidence of the real people who served, because you were taking a group round here, telling them about the Cutty Sark. And wasn't there a very old lady there who had papers that she wanted to give and that tell the story of a relative of hers?
Yeah, we're very, very, very fortunate. So there's an apprentice who served on Cutty Sark in 1886, and actually his daughter is now donating his papers and photographs to us. So we've got this fantastic picture of this individual, a whole career and a whole reason for going to sea. But then we've also got this very personal connection because it's the first time I've ever met a direct descendant. And when you start to do the maths, it doesn't quite work out. But the apprentice was actually 60, in his 60s when he had his daughter. She's now 93. So that's how we can have that direct connection.
So you shook the hand of somebody who is only one generation away from really service on this ship.
Real service on the ship in the 1880s. Yeah.
I mean, not many people get that sort of experience.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's brilliant. Let's get back to the brushes that she's had with disaster, because there was a hurricane in Florida that she managed to survive.
There was, yes. So that was in 1906. This was when the ship was a Portuguese ship. So Cutty Sark had 25 years as a British ship before it was sold and became a cargo carrier for the Portuguese called Ferreira. So at this point...
Ferreira or Ferrari?
Ferreira. Well, it does work. I like it.
Yeah, it does. The Ferrari of the seas, because she was still fast.
She was still fast.
So when she was sold to Portugal, they changed her name?
They changed her name, yes, absolutely. And at that time, she tended to be going from Portugal to Africa over to America. And she happened to be in Florida when this absolutely dreadful hurricane hit. I think 134 people were killed. And so it was pretty perilous, but the ship managed
She
to
still
survive.
managed it. And then in 1916, she nearly sank off the coast of South Africa.
She did.
Which in a way saved her, because 1916, it sort of saved her from some of the worst experiences of the war.
It absolutely did, yes. So the ship had been quite badly loaded with a cargo of coal. So it heavily sort of leaned to one side. And actually, in order to right it, the mast had to be cut off. And so it was kind of languishing in the sea for a while, and eventually it was towed back to South Africa. And as you say, that meant that it missed, because at the time it was a Portuguese ship. Just shortly after that, Portugal became a combatant in the First World War, so Cutty Sark would feasibly have been a genuine target for submarines.
Yeah,
so,
wouldn't she just? And we wouldn't know her now. And then there was the time that she was damaged in a storm and had to call into Falmouth for repairs. But that's when she was spotted. Tell me the story.
Yes,
'cause
yeah.
this changed her career, changed her life.
It completely did. So it's another kind of instance of bad luck and good luck, I think, for Cutty Sark. So this was in 1922, and it was Ferreira at this time, and the ship had been at sea for 52 years. Now, clipper ships were generally built to last for 25 to 30 years. So by 1922, Cutty Sark had outlived most of its contemporaries, had exceeded all expectations. But in terms of it having a future, probably not, because investing more money in it would be harder and harder to justify. So when it arrived in Falmouth in 1922, it had just an amazing good luck because it was spotted by a retired sea captain who was local to the area called Wilfred Dowman. And he, 27 years previously, had been amazed to watch Cutty Sark surge past the ship that he had been serving on. It left a lasting impression. So despite the fact that the ship looked dramatically different, He knew it was a special ship and he vowed to bring it back to Britain, and that's exactly what he did.
How did he do that?
Well, it helped that he was married to a courtauld, so he and his wife, Catherine...
So his wife came from a very posh family.
They had a decent amount of money, I think, but they were also very committed philanthropists, so they gave a lot of money to their community, and they were determined they would bring Cutty Sark back to their community. So they paid over the odds. They brought the ship back to Britain from Portugal. It was restored, renamed Cutty Sark in Falmouth, and then it opened as a cadet training ship and visitor attraction down in Falmouth in 1924.
Well, did he live to see that?
He did, but unfortunately not for very long. By 1936, he had passed away. He was only, I think, about 57, so it was a very premature death. And Catherine didn't feel capable of looking after the ship alone, so she decided it needed a new home at that point.
And is that what ultimately brought her here to Greenwich?
It's part of the process, absolutely. So at that point in 1938, the ship was given to the Incorporated Thames Nautical College down at Greenwich, just further down the river. And there it was to serve alongside HMS Worcester as a cadet training ship. So for boys and young men interested in careers at sea, they could literally use these ships to learn the ropes.
But she came here ultimately. Now, this is another case of terrible bad luck turning to good. In fact, the dry dock where we are, this area, was meant to be for Implacable, wasn't it?
It was, yes.
Which was a different sort of ship entirely.
Completely different. So HMS Implacable was actually a veteran of the Battle of Trafalgar. And it was a very special ship, sort of akin to HMS Victory down in Portsmouth. And so, yes, this site had been promised to Implacable. But I think in the post-Second World War period, obviously, money was pretty scarce. And eventually they felt that there wasn't enough money to save Implacable, to restore it and look after it in Greenwich. So instead the ship was actually scuttled, which is deliberately sunk.
Yeah, there's very upsetting, very old black and white footage of her. Yeah, she was almost just a broken hull. And they dragged her out to sea where she should have sunk because they blew explosives in her. She refused to sink.
Yeah, she didn't want to go, unfortunately.
I don't know why is it upsetting?
It's interesting, isn't it? I think it's a bit like when the fact that we call ships she is we can't help sort of anthropomorphise. They have their personalities, and I think that's the same with Implacable, and certainly the same with Cutty Sark.
Yeah, certainly that's felt, you get that from anyone who's ever served on a ship.
Yeah.
They adore the ship usually, and there's an immense loyalty to the ship.
Definitely, yeah.
So sadly, Implacable did in the end go under the waves. But anyway, this spot was worked out for Cutty Sark to come.
It did, yeah. I mean, the anger that was caused by the scuttling of HMS Implacable was sort of utilised by the then director of the National Maritime Museum, Frank Carr, and he sort of rallied support for Cutty Sark. He was able to secure the site for Cutty Sark, and eventually, with the help of His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh, established the Cutty Sark Preservation Society, which launched an appeal for public funds of £250,000, which would be about £9 million in today's money, to save the ship, build this specially built dry dock, and then restore it and open it to the public.
Yeah, and the money from the lottery fund as well, which helped a lot.
Yes.
So you've got public support, you've got royal support, and then you've got some real money as well.
That's it. And that's happened on 3 occasions for Cutty Sark, in 1922, 1954, and again in 2007. So there's a theme in Cutty Sark's history. Yeah.
It's because we do feel some sort of relationship with her. But even once in dry dock... we've got to talk first, though, about how they even got her into the dry dock.
Okay.
Because I read somewhere there was this extraordinary figure that there was only 45 centimetres of water between the bottom of the dry dock and her.
Yes, absolutely. So
you can't float a ship on 45 centimetres.
I mean, it must have been extremely, extremely challenging. So just 45 centimetres below that keel, below the spine of the ship and basically its base. And it was done with great difficulties. There was lots of pulling from the sides.
Yeah, there was lots of literally man-hauling it in.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's a few instances where some bricks are falling off because the ship has sort of banged in. Yeah. It was not an easy thing to do. But they managed to do it on first attempt, which is pretty amazing. And then they allowed the water that was remaining in this space to drain away with the natural ebb of the tide. Then the wall of the dock was built up quickly, and Cutty Sark had left water for the final time.
Which was brilliant feat in itself. But after a while, displaying her like that, the hull itself started to distort, didn't
Yes,
it?
that's right. Yeah. So originally the hull was replaced. It had a cradle, but it was effectively on the floor. And after 40 odd years, by the 1990s, the hull was starting to sort of collapse in on itself. And a survey was done in which it revealed that a very small percentage of the bolts were performing their original function. So actually, the ship was in a pretty dire state. So they had to find a solution. They had to find a way of saving the ship again, but also hopefully preserving its original shape. And this shape is, of course, what points us to how the ship went so fast through the seas.
What made her clipping through the water. Yeah, but even before they got to that point, or while they were doing it, while they were doing another level of construction, there was a fire.
Yes, yeah.
And if you look at the pictures, you would think that was the end of her completely. But
again, Cutty Sark, good and bad luck. So in 2006, an extensive conservation project had begun, and that project was all about stripping the ship of its original fabric, and that would be then treated elsewhere and then put back eventually onto the ship. So that began in 2006. When the fire struck in May 2007, most of that material had already been removed. So in terms of that original structure, actually the fire was nowhere near as bad as it could have been. I mean, it was still a disaster. It destroyed material that there was no intention of replacing. But in terms of that original structure, very, very little was lost. So again, a very lucky escape.
yeah, I mean, I gather one of the chief engineers was rung in the middle of the night, and they told him the ship is burning from end to end.
Yeah.
And you can't believe it. He couldn't believe it. But they did find that a lot of the reason that it looked such a spectacular fire, actually, was that there was a lot of workman's wood around.
Exactly that,
So you
yes.
could even argue that, you were very lucky again that so much stuff had been moved off elsewhere for restoration.
Yeah, I mean, it was a building site basically by this point. And so, yeah, I think that made the fire worse, but it actually, in some ways, added to Cutty Sark's luck.
I know, and eventually this amazing structure was built, which I think really works because on the outside, it looks like a ship on her own little patch of sea, almost, because the glass looks like blue sea. But inside, if you hadn't done this, you wouldn't have this spectacular view of the hull.
We wouldn't have this, exactly. And it's a pretty unique thing to be able to walk beneath a huge ship.
Yes.
So it's something that's very, very important to us. And actually from down here as well, it's almost like being underwater because you have the glass canopy and it kind of goes up to the waterline of what would have been when Cutty Sark was actually in the water.
You must be very proud of her.
I am very proud, yeah. It's fantastic to be part of Cutty Sark, yeah.
And if we look up far enough up there, we see the figurehead, which is called Nanny. And Nanny has a story all of her own as well.
Nanny certainly does. In fact, we have 3 different nannies. So we have Nanny, the figurehead, has always been Cutty Sark's figurehead, but we have 3 different versions. Now, I'm sure you can imagine that figureheads being right at the front of a vessel, they're very prone to damage and destruction.
They take all the weather, don't they?
They absolutely do. So that's why we have different versions. But it's always been the same character, and that character comes from the Robert Burns poem Tam O'Shanter. And Tam was a farmer who was a bit drunk. He's coming back from market day and he encounters a coven of witches and warlocks dancing in a churchyard, as you do. And he's kind of bewitched by this, literally bewitched. And they're all sort of quite ugly and scary looking, other than the very attractive young witch called Nanny. And Nanny happens to be wearing a short and revealing nightdress, which in Old Scots was called a Cutty Sark. And
sorry, say that again.
so in Old Scots, a short nightdress was called a Cutty Sark.
That's a Cutty Sark.
That's a Cutty Sark, yeah. So it's a very strange name. In his excitement, Tam exclaims, "Well done, Cutty Sark." That reveals that he's been watching. Nanny's not too happy. She chases. Tam knows, I didn't know this until I started in this job, I don't know if you know, but witches can't cross running water. So Tam heads...
Oh, no, I didn't.
There we go. Tam heads for running water, he heads for a bridge. He manages to just about escape from Nanny's clutches, but not before she's grabbed the tail from his horse.
And that's why she's holding a tail.
Yes,
Nice.
so this sort of angry-looking, beautiful witch in her very revealing nightdress, holding a horse's tail, became Cutty Sark's figurehead. But it's a very strange name to have chosen, and we
Yes.
don't know exactly why.
I love it. It sort of starts to make sense, though, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, it's still peculiar, this idea about not being able to cross running water for a ship. It seems strange. But so we don't know exactly why it was chosen, but we do know that John Willis, who owned Cutty Sark, he was a very proud Scotsman. The ship was built in Scotland, it was designed by Scotsmen. So to be named after a phrase from Robert Burns'
It
poem,
is, now we know, uniquely Scottish.
it doesn't feel quite such a leap. And also we know that in the 19th century, racehorses were called Cutty Sark. So I think there's an association that's since been lost. Speed and pursuit, absolutely. Yeah.
And overcoming adversity by the sound
Yes.
of it too. Yeah. And now you've got several of them. 3, I think, yeah. You've got one on the ship.
One on the prow of the ship, absolutely. One at the centre of our display, which is thought to date from the ship's working life. And then one just behind you, which we've recently put on display, which was on the ship from 1957 until 2021.
So Nanny prevails, doesn't she?
She prevails.
In some way or another.
Yes.
And it is an extraordinary display of these figureheads.
Yeah.
I mean, I've always thought figureheads were quite stern and horrible, but most of the ones you've got here come from one collection, don't they?
They do, yes.
And some of them look quite friendly.
Some of them do, yes. Some of them look slightly creepy as well.
So they're always a bit creepy.
Yes, it's that sort of the eyes following you around the room thing. And this is thought to be the largest collection of merchant ship figureheads in the world. So they all came from trading ships like Cutty Sark, and all roughly contemporary to Cutty Sark too. And they were donated to Cutty Sark in the 1950s as a memorial to the little boats of Dunkirk that helped with the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force in 1940.
Fabulous. And now we know why she's holding the tail.
That's it. Absolutely.
I thought it was just to show how windy it was, but now there's a real story to it. Thank you so much.
Absolute
It must
pleasure.
be such fun. You've been here 8 years now.
I have, yeah.
And we're celebrating 50 years?
70.
75 years? 70 years.
70.
That's right. I should know that, shouldn't I? Because Cutty Sark was brought here the year I was born.
Ah.
Yeah, so I should know that. But 70 years.
70
and
years.
how many people in those 70 years have actually got to see her?
Well over 17 million. We know that 17 million have been walked across the decks, but of course many more people have stood outside and taken photos as well.
Yeah.
So, and we hope to welcome many more.
Absolutely. And it's very much a legacy year, but the fact that she's still here is amazing in itself.
It is.
So these amazing visitors who manage to get here and walk around, it's quite a feat in itself just being able to tread her boards, isn't it?
It is.
I mean, what sort of things can they do and experience here?
So you can go through, so obviously you can walk beneath the ship itself, and you can go through all 3 decks of Cutty Sark. So Cutty Sark has 3 decks, 2 internal and 1 on top called the main deck. And that's kind of where the ship really comes to life, because that's where the crew members would have spent the vast majority of their time. So that's where the deck houses are, that's where all the ship equipment is, that's where all the rigging and the masts are, and also where the ship's wheel is. So that's really our sort of fantastic highlight of any visit to Cutty Sark.
So the captain's cabin, did he live in relative luxury?
In comparison to his, to his charges, he did, absolutely. But, I'd still prefer a Premier Inn myself.
Well, and I know that the ship's cook complains that he's got to cook all this food for the others and try and keep the menu interesting, knocking the weevils out of the bread.
Knocking the weevils out, absolutely, yes.
But there was livestock kept on board, obviously for food reasons.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, if you can imagine, most of Cutty Sark's voyages lasted for about 9 to 10 months, and there weren't very many opportunities to collect fresh food. So you'd have to take a lot of dried food, it'd be a lot of salted meat. This is kind of pre-refrigeration, so the choices were quite limited. So in order to enhance that, Cutty Sark would carry pigs and also chickens on board.
Yeah. And we can see just how small the kitchen was.
It's
for
tiny.
This poor ship's cook.
It's absolutely tiny, yeah. And he'd be there all the time, because you'd have to be... Come rain or shine, you couldn't not be served food, because obviously that was essential because of all the calories that they're burning. So he had to be, no matter what the weather, in his tiny little galley making food for everyone.
Now the first thing you'll notice, it's not very big inside here, is it? This here is my hot coal oven and stove, just down here, where we keep all the fresh flour. Now this over here is the fresh meat cupboard. Now if you look carefully on the side here, we've got a bit of mesh lining. Now those are little air hole pockets. You see, we're going to be on these long sea voyages for about 2.5 months, and we want to dry the meat to make the meat last even longer. Now, still think I've got some fresh bit of pork in there. Let's have a look see, shall we? Ooh, look at that, nice and fresh and ready to go. Fancy some of that, yeah? All right, oh, but don't touch, go wash your hands first. Now, how many meals do you reckon get cooked in here? Well, there's 24 hours in a day, and we work every 4 hours, and we eat some grub in between them. So, let me test your maths, all right? How many falls in 24? 6. So I cook 6 meals per day for over 26 crew members every single day. Now, whew, that is a lot of cooking.
When you're showing people around, I mean, what are they most likely to say to you? Are they particularly surprised at anything?
There's lots of things. I mean, one thing that always comes up is that when we enter the deck house, everyone comments on how small the bunks are. And they are very small, they're very, very titchy. Partly it's because they were shorter than we are today, but actually the main reason is that if you've got any hope of staying in your bunk, it needs to be really nice and snug. And I think that paints a picture of how much the ship would have been moving, rocking and rolling all over the place.
So the smaller the bed, the more likely you were to be curled up safely in it.
Absolutely that, yeah.
Crumbs, it must have been tough.
I think it was very tough,
And
yes.
those voyages were long, as you say.
They were long, yes. And we have various captain's logs as well, which tell us about the conditions on board. So we know of one particular occasion where a huge wave came across the ship and it actually filled the deck house up to the top bunk. So that's an awful lot of water. That's all of your belongings soaking wet. And just imagine that freezing cold water.
In the logs, or whatever you've seen of it, did they ever have any cool times when they were stopped at a nice island or something and could actually enjoy life?
Occasionally they did. I mean, when they went to Australia, they were often in Australia around Christmas time, and of course, weather-wise, that's a really nice time to be in Australia. Yeah. And we know that they often went for little picnics in Sydney Bay. So they certainly had some downtime where they could enjoy these beautiful locations.
No, I'm glad about that. Thank you so much for telling us about the extraordinary life of an amazing ship.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.
This grand old lady of the sea, the Cutty Sark, was first brought here 70 years ago. And in those 70 years, apparently 17 million people have come to see her. I wonder for how much longer she'll stand here, ever resilient to the ravages of time. For the moment until we see each other again, I'm Anne Diamond, and this is the Cutty Sark.